Hello and welcome to the podcast. Let's get to know celebrating diversity at MIT. I'm your host, Neel Bardhan, a postdoc in the lab of Professor Angela Belcher in the Koch Institute for Integrative Cancer Research at MIT. This is the very first episode, and we are recording this on the 5th day of February in 2021. So before I introduce our guest for today, I'd like to make a few quick comments. For those of you who are listening to this podcast, we also have a YouTube channel celebrating diversity. The link will be down in the description. So feel free to watch this show on YouTube and like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you can get notified about future episodes. Also leave a comment down there in the YouTube comment section suggesting what questions you'd like us to ask our future guests. And for those of you who are watching us, I'd like to assure you that we are following all appropriate social distancing protocols. So this podcast series is made possible by grant funding through MIT's MindHandHeart Innovation Fund. So a big thank you to them. I'd also like to express my gratitude to Professor Angela Belcher for always supporting my ideas, to the KI's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, especially to Terry, Benta, Kerry, Quincy, and Mike Moran for helping put all of this together, and to Jay from our lab for helping with the logistics. So the goal of this podcast series is to invite KI community members from different cultural, national, ethnic, or racial backgrounds to share their personal experiences. And we hope to get to know others' cultures better so that we broaden our perspectives and to promote diversity and inclusion in our community. And with that, without any further ado, I'm especially thrilled and excited to welcome our first guest on the maiden episode of this podcast. Please welcome Ms. Uyanga Tsedev, who is a grad student in the Belcher Lab, a longtime colleague of mine, as well as an entrepreneur and co-founder. Uyanga, welcome, and thank you for joining us on this podcast today.
No, yes, thank you very much for having me. This is very exciting. And I'm glad that I'm the first guest, so I don't have to go over high expectations, not just yet.
I'm super excited as well to have you, and let's make this an interesting conversation, shall we?
Yeah, for sure, definitely.
So to start things off, Uyanga, how about you tell us a little bit about yourself? Like, what's your background? And as I understand, you're also an immigrant to the United States. So tell us a little bit about your story.
Yeah, sure, I can do that. So I'm a Mongolian citizen, and I grew up in Mongolia for about the first 10 years of my life. And my name, Uyanga, actually translates to melody directly from the Mongolian language. And you'll find that a lot of Mongolian names actually have kind of a natural translation like that. But yeah, when I was 10, I ended up moving with my family to Hawaii, where my mom was doing her PhD at the University of Hawaii in the economics department. And so both my parents are academics, and they spent the next about 10 or so years in Hawaii, and I grew up there, went to middle school, high school, and eventually applied to colleges in the US and did the standard track, I suppose, for universities here. I ended up in Cambridge at Harvard University, did my undergrad, and straight from there decided I'm going to keep on going with school and came to MIT. So that's kind of the basic resume, I guess, for me in terms of what I've been doing since the age of 10. But, it's been a very interesting, I suppose, journey in terms of continents and climates and people. The kind of Mongolian childhood experience that I have and the kind of family culture that I have is very different, I suppose, and very unique compared to what I encountered in Hawaii. And what I, internalized from my time in Hawaii is also quite interesting and different from, coming to Cambridge to the Northeast with this really, rushing, vibrant, busy city. It's quite a transition from a tropical island lifestyle. And so that's kind of what, my timeline has been.
Wow, wonderful. Thanks for sharing your life's journey, so to speak. And thanks for also letting us know that your name, Uyanga, actually has a meaning in your native language. So sounds very melodious to me. And coming from India myself, I think a lot of Indian names too have translation component, usually some religious or mythological symbolism in the Indian languages. So I guess a lot of Asian cultures have something in common right there. And so you mentioned that you grew up for the first part of your life in Mongolia and then moved to Hawaii when your parents moved there for academia, and then did the high school and then did undergrad at Harvard and finally moved to MIT. So tell us something a little bit about what challenges did you face along the way? What adversities did you have to overcome, if you're willing to share some of
Yeah,
that?
sure, definitely. I mean, I think the number one, the most obvious thing is I came, 5th grade elementary school, and I didn't speak English, but I did have a couple of years of French, so I knew the alphabet, so I could sound things, but I didn't know what they meant. And being, I suppose, kind of the A-type that I am, when I was a kid, I knew that I was I'm the number one in the class, I'm good at this. And then you come over and you can't even speak the language. It was horrifying. So that's one of, the kind of basic or the first challenges that I think most immigrants face when you come to a different speaking country, a nation. It's such a huge part of being accepted, I think, and being considered competent in some ways. To mastery of the language is kind of a, I think, big story for a lot of immigrant families. So that's first. And then I think what follows is, my family, once I moved to college, decided to go back to Mongolia. So now they're in Mongolia, and they've been in Mongolia for, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years, 8 years, more than that. And so, Hawaii is far away from Boston, but now, they're in Mongolia, and that's literally a 24-hour flight distance, and a 24-hour time difference. And so, not 24, I'm saying 12-hour time difference. So being able to keep in touch and stay connected with my family unit is always a challenge and something that I have to really prioritize and make time for. My family is very close. When we were together in Hawaii, it was 4 of us. There weren't very many other Mongolians. And we went through everything together, and that contributes, I think, to how close we are, and maybe just, it's the nature of my parents. They're very affectionate. And so maintaining that connection once they moved and I was, in the U.S. by myself, was a very important challenge and important thing for me. And especially, I think a lot of people and a lot of immigrants or, foreign students, international students can relate to during the COVID times is once borders close, these things become even more difficult. And luckily, we live in the times of Skype and Zoom, but, I would consider myself lucky if I was able to see them once a year, take a trip during the summer, take some time off from the grad school for this. And, with the recent pandemic, many people haven't been able to do that, and I haven't been able to do that. So it really puts things in perspective. Although it doesn't compare to the stories my parents would tell me, of their time in the Soviet Union, going to college there, and they'd get on a train for a week to go home. That's, it's different, but I would say that's definitely been a challenge for me this year. And I think as, in the academic journey, I guess going from college, to graduate school and becoming a fully fledged adult in that time one of the things that I did struggle with is knowing what I really actually wanted to do. A lot of us enter graduate school, jump straight in from undergrad with a lot of enthusiasm, not really knowing what we're getting into. And so this is a common story where halfway through you kind of have a crisis. Is this what I really want to do? You kind of realize you've gone quite deep in, to this program, and is this meeting the expectations that you had? And so that was an interesting journey for me because, I entered MIT as a mechanical engineer, and now I'm with Angela Belcher in the biological engineering department. And so that was quite a switch at that time. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Thanks a lot, Uyanga, for sharing all of those experiences. I think we all can relate to most of those on a certain level, especially being an immigrant myself. I can relate to the feelings of loneliness and being away from family. And coming from an Asian background, I can also say that we're especially close as a family unit growing up. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. I'm sure a lot of our audience can also feel the same way. And judging by your English right now, it's hard to imagine that you mentioned that you had trouble picking up English when you first moved to the United States. So that's an extremely wonderful sense of accomplishment right there. And
well, it comes off with a trade-off. I think with most people who move and pick up another language at a young age, you kind of you have to really keep your original language in practice and maintain that, and sometimes you lose it. And so I did make that trade-off. I sound like an 8-year-old when I speak in Mongolian. It's not great.
It's interesting that you bring that up. So I was going to ask, perhaps you could share with us 1 or 2 sentences in Mongolian. Like, how do if I go to Mongolia, and it's certainly piqued my interest, and I should put that on my bucket list once we get traveling again after the pandemic. But let's say I go to Mongolia, and how do I greet a person there?
Yeah, so I can give you the very basic hello.
Yes.
And so that's Sambanu. It's basically, how are you? So Sambanu. And then I think one phrase that's really useful is thank you. Hospitality and friendliness and curiosity with foreigners and newcomers is a very big deal in Mongolia, especially considering the nomadic culture. So being able to communicate your gratefulness, I think is very important. So yeah, thank you is Bayerla.
Could you repeat that once again, please?
Bayerla.
Bayerla.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I definitely need to practice my Mongolian before I head over there.
Yeah, no worries. I have to too.
Those are extremely valuable life lessons learned along the way. And the other part that you mentioned about your, I wouldn't call it a struggle, but sort of finding your way around grad school.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important and interesting that you mentioned that a lot of us go through the same thing while going through grad school. And that brings us to the next segment of our show. Let's talk about career.
Mm-hmm.
So where do you think your career is going after MIT? And more broadly speaking, where do you see yourself in 5 years?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. There's so many possibilities. As you know, I'm right at the cusp of defending and really thinking about the transition here. And, at this point, you realize there's so many options. There's so many paths you could take. But I have been very interested in kind of transitional medicine from, doing the actual research at the wet bench to how do we get all these cool, interesting new innovations that's coming out of these labs straight to the bedside and into patients. And that's something I've been very passionate about. And so right now, I think what has been most attractive to me is delving right into that kind of development process. And that's something, biotech startups in Kendall Square and Central Lab have focused a great deal on and they've had a great deal of success with. And the community around that has grown quite a bit in the years that I've been here. There's a lot of support and structure here at MIT and outside of MIT, innovation centers, the sandbox, the venture mentorship program, things like that. And so that has really led me to explore that arena. And as you have mentioned, I'm working with a small team to co-found a company that's spinning directly out of some of the work that we do in the Belcher Lab and the work that I've been working on for my PhD thesis. And it's because maybe it's an idea that came so close to our hearts, it's very exciting to me, and it feels like it's possible to continue. And so if that 1% chance that we succeed, it does come true, I want to say that in 5 years, I want to see our little biotech company out there doing clinical trials in patients who really have an unmet clinical need, and making, a significant difference in their disease progression. So that's kind of like my pipe dream. And very briefly, the company that we're doing, M13 Therapeutics, we focus on using phage, bacteriophage. These are viruses that infect bacteria, and really are not tropic to human cells. We're engineering them to be a very interesting platform for potentially carrying DNA cargo to human cells. And so in this way, we can consider, gene therapy for genes that might be defective or missing in individuals with rare diseases. So these are things like cystic fibrosis, genetic epilepsies, and so on and so forth. And the area of genetic medicine is really booming right now, and there's a lot of promising new data and a lot of new interesting technologies coming out. And I really feel that our particular platform has a chance at making a difference. Mm-hmm.
Wow, thanks for sharing, and thanks for sharing about your startup company as well. We wish you all the very best in moving this from the lab to the clinic and starting to treat patients successfully. I know it sounds like a scary idea for me to even comprehend. Doing research in the lab is one thing, but actually having your materials go into human patients, that's a significant jump, and we wish you all the very best. And hopefully in 5 years, if you're doing your next big IPO on the New York Stock Exchange, I'll be the first person to have interviewed the co-founder of this new biotech company. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
And so then, being in a scientific field, things are challenging. Research doesn't always progress linearly. So one of the questions that I like to ask people is, who is your mentor? Who do you look forward to or seek out guidance when you're running into issues?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So, the very obvious answer here is my PI. So, Angela Belcher, she's currently the head of biological engineering at MIT. But, she's been with me through all of my journey, basically all of my 20s at MIT. And not only is she so very impressive, just on paper and what she's done in her life, but personally, she's not afraid to relate her own stories and really give me the space to make my own mistakes and console me when I do. So, that to me has been invaluable, and I think that's the type of mentorship that really helps me grow as far as my academic career goes. But outside of that, the people that I seek out, and I have mentioned already how close I am to my family, the people that I seek out when I'm just feeling emotionally rattled is, of course, my parents. And I think something about the fact that they're completely outside of my field, outside of science, outside of the just grueling task that is to, amass data really helps. They have a very chill, should I say, or laid back perspective on success and failure. And so having them whispering in my ear, it doesn't matter. It's comforting. Yeah. So that's where I go for my comfort. But yeah, so that's basically my two answers to your question.
Great, and that leads to a nice segue to our next segment. So, life beyond the lab, right? So you mentioned like gathering data is a grueling task, and I can speak from personal experience as well. So perhaps you could share with our audience how do you spend your free time? Like, what hobbies do you enjoy?
Oh yes. So before I went into the deep dive of trying to really wrap everything up, in my spare time, I would cook a lot, and I would read a lot, and paint a lot. So those are kind of like my three distractions, escapist, I suppose, hobbies. Cooking, it's almost an extension of lab work in many ways. I feel like there's a reason so many biologists and chemists end up opening breweries and bakeries. Yeah, so that was, that's something that I really love, and you, at the end of it, come up with something edible, something rewarding,
Just jumping in here, in the Belcher Lab, we've been spoiled by Uyanga's exceptional matcha tea cupcakes for the audience.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so, that's great. And reading, I really enjoy sci-fi, and I really enjoy fantasy as two genres to delve into. I think sci-fi really appeals to that kind of, optimistic, crazy future thinking side of me, and then the fantasy is just all about escapism. And then, of course, I mentioned painting. I've always been really into kind of mixed media arts and artistic expression and things like that. And so given my resources, my rented apartment, the easiest thing really to is go grab some paint and get a canvas, and that's really fun to do.
And the other thing that I'm sure a lot of people watching or listening are curious about is, as scientists, like, do you feel like being in a high pressure lab environment has limited your ability to socialize, or have you found ample opportunities to mingle in the so-called real world out there?
Well, I feel that I have had a chance to really socialize, but I do recognize that my social circles might be just other grad students. MIT and grad school in general really does a good job of fostering these communities where you can commiserate over your common experience, and so that's been great for me. As far as limiting my socializing, really the main thing is, I think in academia we end up kind of carrying our work and our bench and our thoughts from the day throughout all of our daylight hours, so the kind of cutoff when you get home, you don't stop thinking about what you've been doing, and so it's almost like a mental block. That's really the kind of main challenge that I've seen for myself is I can't seem to leave work at work. It's always with me.
So research is a 24/7 enterprise.
It is, and it's also a part of the culture. I think when you become an engineer or a scientist, you sort of assume that as an identity as opposed to just this is my employment or this is my work. And I don't know if that's right or wrong, but that is what is true for me.
Well, thanks for sharing those. And so this brings us to the most anticipated part of the show, or at least what I'm looking forward to most, is the cultural diversity part. And so I'd like to invite our guests to share some examples of things which are unique to your Mongolian culture and background.
Yeah, so I wanted to share, first of all, as this is a podcast, a brief snippet from this band that I think perhaps the audience might enjoy. This is a band called The Who. And so they're a Mongolian rock metal band, but very folky. So they do use all of the traditional instruments that have been played for generations, and they use the kind of singing techniques that have been passed down from thousands of years ago. And so Mongolian music and folk music is very well known for throat singing. So throat singing,
Vocal singing.
Yeah, vocalizing two tones. So it's dual tone singing, and a lot of the sounds and kind of the beat takes inspiration from the nomadic lifestyle and kind of that connection with nature. So you'll hear bird-like sounds. You hear kind of galloping type of beat. The horse is a very important symbol to the Mongolian culture. And so I actually had a chance to see The Who come to Boston before the pandemic. And it was very exciting. I haven't really been to many concerts in my life, but, it's a very hypey type of music. So if you're feeling like you want something to push you through that last, data set while at the bench, I would recommend this band. And so I'll go to their album and, wow, it's hard to pick which one. So that's just a sample.
Beautiful. Very upbeat music, like you said. Especially in these challenging times, we could all use some upbeat music. And you said the name of the band is The Who.
The HU.
So, folks, there you have it. Maybe next time they're playing in Boston, you can go check them out.
Yeah. They'll definitely get you excited. It's all about, waking up that warrior spirit and getting people to think about nature, think about the planet and how we're connected, and how we want to take care of it.
Very promising.
Yeah, so I guess another thing that I can share is also kind of from the traditional Mongolian repertoire is the clothing lines that have come out in recent years that kind of fuse traditional Mongolian ethics, I suppose, with practical modern design, and also kind of the arts that's really become big in Mongolia these days, painting and work that really express kind of Mongolian individuality in the younger generation. And so I came today because we're doing the podcast wearing all made in Mongolia clothes.
Well, thank you for showing us some of the Mongolian attire.
Yeah, so this is a modern Mongolian attire. The kind of traditional attire is obviously extremely intricate, embroidered, silks and furs and many layers.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to wear that while doing lab bench work.
Right. But, the clothing that I really enjoy, being able to visit my parents and I hit up the shops and find these clothes is because everything's made from natural wools and cashmeres, and these are all materials that felts and things. These are all materials that have been in use to keep the Mongolian people warm through the Siberian winters for many, many, many generations. And this is like one of the secrets that keep me warm during the Boston winters. And of course, the younger upcoming designers are also incorporating a lot of the themes and interesting images that reflect the culture. And so here's a scarf, a cashmere scarf that my mom gifted to me, and you can see that we have the Mongolian yurt, we call them gers, and it's situated in front of this beautiful kind of colorful landscape, and it reminds me of kind of a mirage when you're out there on the steppes. Actually, you see mirages quite a bit and people warn you about them.
Are we referring to the mirages in the Gobi Desert?
Yeah, so the desert landscape, actually my dad is from one of the most northern dunes in the world, so it's in the west of Mongolia, and that's the region where he's from. And we visit there when I have the time to go in the summers, and it's a beautiful, just wide expanse of space, and it really makes you feel free and completely unencumbered by the worries of modern civilization.
All the cares of the world seem to disappear.
Yeah, so exactly. So I really enjoy these materials and these images that have been kind of imprinted on these new designs are here with me today, and I wear it every day, and it's practical, and it harks to just like the animal husbandry traditions of the Mongolian people. And here's another example that I brought. This is a silk one, and here you can see that there's patterns that hark back to, Mongolian yurt design here. And this is the traditional image of what a Mongolian lady would be wearing. And one of the very unique things I think about traditional Mongolian attire is the headdresses. So you can see here she's got her hair done up in kind of a horn shape on the two sides of her head. And they use it to glue it, They grow their hair really long and then they glue it in the shape. You call it either a cow horn or a goat horn. And so it's just very unique. And if you are a fan of Star Wars, you might notice that Padme, I believe, she has an attire that takes inspiration from the Mongolian traditional clothes. And you can see her sporting the kind of big headdress in one of the Star Wars movies. So, yeah.
Beautiful. The patterns are really striking, especially on the scarf that you're wearing right now. And can you tell us about what kind of, is that a wool material or?
This one's a cashmere material. So the 5 main kind of herding animals in the Mongolian tradition is the goat, the sheep, the cow, the camel, and the horse. So those are the 5 main ones, and you have blankets made out of camel wool. You'll have your gear, made and buckled up with wool and felt from your sheep fleece, and cashmere. It's great for keeping warm, making warm socks, and soft on the skin. So these are all materials that just come naturally to that way of life.
That's excellent. I might even ask you later on where I can buy some of these for my wife.
Certainly. Nowadays, everything's online, so you can Google it.
So, speaking of culture, and you mentioned this somewhat in the initial part of our conversation, but how do you relate to this culture now, being in the United States? Do you find it challenging, or are you still tightly interwoven with your culture back home?
I think, my family really keeps that culture alive for me. And that, the fact that my family is so important to me plays a huge role in that. But I think, Mongolia is one of the most, least populated countries, least dense countries in the world. I don't know if it still holds that record, but probably. There's only 3.5 million of us in Mongolia. And so it's very unlikely that you would meet another Mongolian, out there just wandering in your vicinity. So that is a challenge for me. But, Boston does have a community, and they get together over Facebook. And, when the important dates come, Lunar New Year, which is a very important kind of family celebration, or New Year's Eve, which is a modern celebration that's very important to kind of the post-Soviet era Mongolian people. People get together and kind of relive and kind of go through the rituals, right, that keep the traditions alive. And so yeah, I think I've been able to maintain a lot of my connections, and but we'll see. It's the longer and longer you stay away, you kind of transfuse into kind of a new, create your own traditions and take what you know from your past and incorporate what you want for your future. And so it'll be interesting, especially now that I have started a family. I recently, got married.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. And so, when my husband is not Mongolian, and, he grew up in a Russian tradition, a Ukrainian tradition. And so it'll be kind of a melding of the two, and we'll have to pick and choose what we want. So that'll be an interesting journey as well.
I wish you all the very best.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing your life story and your culture with us today. I actually learned more about you in the last 30 minutes than I did in the 5 years I've known you in lab, which has been more from a professional standpoint than on a personal basis. So I'm actually glad we're doing this kind of a podcast to get to know people more on a personal level. And so in terms of closing thoughts, to all the young boys and girls out there who may be listening or watching this video, what would you say to them, like, who are perhaps considering a career in the scientific arena, in the STEM fields?
Oh, wow, yeah. So I would definitely say that there is no standard way to get to where you want to be. I really, I didn't know what I was doing when I committed to a lot of the things that I committed to, and you figure it out on the way, and everybody does, takes this path and meanders in different ways, and there's no formula to this. I think that really is the most important thing to remember, because sometimes, at least I remember feeling that, I needed to create a checklist and do A, B, C, D, and E, F, and there was these standard things, and that needed to be done to get where I wanted to go, but that's not necessarily true. You can always invent a side road. No one's going to stop you, I promise. Yeah.
That's extremely inspiring, and I'm sure a lot of young folks would look forward to such an exciting journey in their lives as well. With that, I'd like to once again, thank you, Uyanga, for sharing your time with us. You're extremely busy these days trying to wrap up your thesis, as well as co-found a new startup company. So we appreciate you being here and sharing your life story with us. And thank you to the audience for listening to us today. And do share this video with your friends and colleagues, and let us know in the comments what other types of questions you'd like us to ask our next guests. Thank you. Bye-bye.